My name is Hazel Carter, and I am 70 years old. Tonight, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family and myself could change in a single moment. I had spent hours preparing dinner, hoping for peace, for just one evening where the weight of life could feel lighter. The kitchen smelled of vanilla pudding. The chicken simmered gently, and the silverware gleamed in the soft light. I had poured my heart into this meal, remembering every detail that might bring comfort to my son, Daniel. I wanted to feel close to him again, to remind him of all the years we had shared. Then she arrived, Kendra. She wore a red dress that seemed to radiate confidence, as if it had been tailored to announce her presence. I tried to smile, hoping to ignore the tension I already sensed. Daniel seemed restless, avoiding my gaze, fidgeting with his phone. I carried the pudding to the table, recalling the way Daniel used to scrape every last spoonful when he was a boy, telling me I was the best cook in the world. I wanted to reach that moment of warmth again, but her words cut through the air. Sharper than anything I had imagined, she compared me to her own mother and told me I was less than. I felt the spoon freeze in my hand, the silence pressing down on every corner of the room. For a moment, my heart pounded, unsure whether I would collapse under the weight of humiliation or find the strength to stand. And then, something deep inside me shifted. I remembered every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every penny I had carefully saved to help them live comfortably. I realized that my love had been used, and that my quiet devotion had made me invisible. That night, as I placed the spoon down and pushed back my chair, I felt a strange calm rising within me. I was no longer willing to let their expectations dictate my life. I thought of Daniel and Kendra, oblivious to the truth of my sacrifices, and I knew it was time to speak. That simple act of honesty, revealing the truth about the rent I had been paying, was the first step in reclaiming the respect I had long been denied. I wanted my son to see the reality of his choices, to understand what his actions had cost me not in money alone, but in years of devotion and silent suffering. And in that moment, as their faces shifted from smug certainty to stunned awareness, I realized that tonight would mark the beginning of my transformation. I would no longer be invisible, no longer bend under the weight of unspoken expectations. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in decades, I felt the spark of agency, a reminder that life could still hold moments of power, of choice, and of self-respect. I remember thinking how strange it felt to feel strong in the midst of such confrontation, how terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I wondered if they would ever truly see me, or if I would have to continue standing in this newfound light on my own. That evening, as the pudding sat untouched and the crystal glasses reflected the tension in the room, I knew that the next chapter of my life was about to begin, and I was ready to step into it. I've lived in this small Ohio town for more than 30 years, raising my son and working as a seamstress. Every dress I stitched, every coat I patched, every hem I pressed was part of my way of showing love, of making life a little easier for others. My hands still bear the calluses from decades of labor, proof of a life spent caring quietly. I never thought of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as devotion. When Daniel first lost his job, I remember the knot in my stomach as he stood on my porch, his eyes red from stress, asking for help. He pleaded quietly, and I believed him. thinking I was protecting Kendra's pride when really, I was protecting his own comfort. I opened my savings account, the one I had painstakingly built over decades, and began paying their rent $900 each month, plus $100 for the landlord's processing fee, every 5th day of the month without fail. I cut corners wherever I could. Dinner became rice and eggs night after night. I stretched my arthritis medicine, wore my old shoes until they split. And still, I told myself it was worth it because my son needed me. But the reality was painful. Daniel and Kendra went on trips, bought clothes I knew they couldn't afford, and I carried their burden quietly, hoping they would one day recognize my efforts. I thought they would feel grateful. Instead, I learned that love without boundaries can erase you piece by piece, until you no longer recognize yourself. This house, my home for 30 years, was filled with memories, quilt squares stitched from scraps, rocking chairs worn by nights of nursing, Daniel through fevers. Each corner whispered a story of care, of patience, of quiet hope. I believed that giving was the same as loving, but sometimes, I see now, helping too much can let others take without seeing you at all. I remember thinking of these things that evening, carrying Daniel's favorite meal to the table: chicken in mushroom sauce, rice with vegetables, and vanilla pudding, the one he loved as a boy. I wanted him to feel comfort, to feel home. I wanted Kendra to see the warmth of a mother's love, the care behind every detail. But even as I hoped for a gentle evening, I could feel the tension tightening, like the calm before a storm. And in that quiet anticipation, I understood something I hadn't before. All those small, unnoticed sacrifices had built a foundation for the moment I was about to claim my voice. I carried not only the food, but the weight of years of devotion, and I realized that it was time for them to see the truth. As I set the pudding on the table and looked at Daniel's averted eyes, I felt both fear and resolve. Fear of shattering the fragile peace, but resolve, a strength born from decades of giving. I knew that in this evening, the story of my life would intersect with the story of my courage, and that the next steps would be mine to take. This memory of years past, of patience, of quiet giving, led me directly to the confrontation that would change everything. It prepared me to face Kendra's words, to finally stop being invisible, and to stand in the light of my own truth. For months, I carried their burden quietly, thinking that love meant doing everything for my son, even when it hurt me. I remember evenings when dinner was nothing more than rice and scrambled eggs, because every dollar I had went to covering their apartment rent. I stretched my arthritis medication until the pain kept me awake at night, and I wore shoes so worn that the soles were splitting, all without complaining. I convinced myself that all this suffering was worth it because Daniel needed me. But the quiet life I built for myself, careful, steady, and simple, was invisible to them. I watched, often in silence, as Daniel and Kendra went out to dinners I could never afford, posted photos of weekend trips, and lived comfortably while I sacrificed everything. Each picture, each post, was a reminder of the gap between the life I was supporting and the life I was actually living. I wondered if they ever thought about me at all, or if they assumed my love was endless and unquestioning. I had given them comfort, stability, and security, and yet I carried the weight of loneliness and frustration. I wanted one evening to be perfect, one moment where my effort was recognized. I cooked Daniel's favorite meal: chicken in mushroom sauce, rice with vegetables, and the vanilla pudding he loved since he was a boy. I polished the silverware, set out the crystal glasses, and even placed the quilt my mother had stitched across the sofa to remind myself of family and continuity. As I prepared the table, I reflected on how easy it had been for me to let my own needs fade into the background. I had always believed that helping them was love, but I was beginning to see that constant giving without acknowledgement can slowly erase a person. And yet, I hoped that tonight would be different. I hoped for a quiet dinner, for a moment of connection, for Daniel to look at me and remember the mother who had always been there. The tension had been simmering for months. I felt it in Daniel's nervous movements, the way he avoided my gaze, the way he tapped at his phone as if it held all the answers he didn't want to speak aloud. And then there was Kendra, her presence sharp, polished, and unyielding, moving through the room with confidence that made my heart tighten. I wondered how someone could be so oblivious to the sacrifices made on their behalf, and yet so assured that they were entitled. I thought about the lessons I had taught Daniel, the stories I had shared, the nights I stayed awake worrying for him. And in that quiet, I realized that this tension, this frustration, had built the stage for a moment that would define the next chapter of my life. I was carrying more than just financial responsibility. I was carrying the weight of recognition, respect, and self-worth. I remember standing there, holding the pudding, listening to the clock tick, and understanding that the evening would force a reckoning, and as much as I wanted to keep the peace, a part of me knew that my patience had limits. The sacrifices I had made quietly would not remain invisible forever. Tonight, something had to change, and I was ready to face it. I carried the pudding to the table, remembering how Daniel used to scrape the bowl clean when he was a little boy, telling me I was the best cook in the world. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope that tonight would be gentle, that we could share laughter over dessert, and that Kendra might even soften. But the moment she leaned back, her expression sharp and self-satisfied, the weight of all the months of sacrifice pressed down on me again. I realized then that no amount of careful cooking or thoughtful preparation could shield me from the truth they had taken my generosity for granted, and my presence for granted. And something inside me shifted. For the first time in a long while, fear did not dominate me. Instead, clarity rose, steady and unwavering. I thought of every penny spent, every sleepless night, every corner of my life adjusted to hold them, and I knew I could no longer stay invisible. I reflected quietly on the rent I had been paying, $900 a month, plus the $100 processing fee for months now, all to keep their lives comfortable while mine had been squeezed into sacrifice. I remembered counting every dollar, choosing rice over chicken for myself, postponing medicine for pain, and enduring aches in my body and heart alike. The unfairness of it, the sheer expectation that I would silently absorb everything, made my pulse rise with a quiet intensity. In that stillness, I made a decision. I would speak my truth not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity and firmness. I revealed to them how I had been covering the apartment all this time, how I had silently carried the weight so that they could live without worry. I described it evenly, fact by fact, letting the gravity of the revelation settle in the room. The silence that followed was palpable. Daniel's face drained of color. Kendra's confidence wavered. For the first time, they were confronted with the full reality of my sacrifices. I felt a surge of empowerment. I knew I could no longer allow my care to be mistaken for weakness. I set the boundary clearly. The lease would end in 30 days, and I would not pay another cent. This was not revenge. It was survival, respect for myself, and the acknowledgement that love without limits should never mean erasing who I am. As I stood there, I noticed the subtle reactions: Daniel's shock mixed with guilt. Kendra's frustration softened into confusion. I allowed myself to feel the long suppressed emotions: relief, anger, and an unexpected pride. For decades, I had bent, softened, and compromised. But tonight, I was standing tall. I was no longer invisible. I reflected on what this confrontation would mean in the coming days. Would Daniel finally step up? Or would he stumble under the responsibility I had forced into the open? Could Kendra adjust to the boundaries I had set? I realized that I could not control their responses, only my own actions and choices. And in that acceptance, a new sense of freedom emerged, one that had been buried under years of quiet giving. Even as the tension lingered and the room seemed to hold its breath, I knew that the first major step of reclaiming my life had been taken. I could feel a line drawn, a moment that would mark the turning point of my journey. The air was heavy, yet lighter than it had been in years, carrying the weight of honesty, of truth spoken, and of the first breath of empowerment. And as I began to clear the dishes, placing the pudding aside and straightening the table, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. This confrontation was only the beginning. The steps I would take next, facing their responses, encouraging Daniel's growth, and opening my own path to joy would define the chapters to come. Tonight had proven that standing up for myself was not only possible, but necessary. After that evening, the air in my home felt different. The tension had shifted, leaving space for honesty, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel entirely responsible for everyone else's choices. Daniel began to take steps I had long hoped he would. He found night work, enrolled in online classes, and even started attending therapy. I observed quietly, letting him show me, through his actions, that he was learning to stand on his own. It was humbling and heartening to witness the man he was becoming, one who could finally bear responsibility without leaning on me. I also realized that my own life had been paused for decades. I had sacrificed my comfort, my health, and my time for others. And yet there was a world waiting beyond the walls of this house, beyond the roles I had assumed. Then came the call from Tom, my college sweetheart. Hearing his voice after so many years stirred a mix of nostalgia, fear, and excitement. He spoke gently, recalling old memories and inviting me to spend a month in Seattle. No expectations, only the chance to reconnect and explore what life could still hold for me. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, weighing the risks and the possibilities. I questioned myself: was I chasing old dreams, or was I finally allowing myself to choose my own happiness? I thought of the careful lists I had made, balancing risk with opportunity, remembering that this decision was not about punishing anyone, but about claiming a life that had been on hold for too long. When I packed my suitcase, I selected dresses I had sewn for myself, colors that reminded me of joy and freedom. Daniel helped me to the airport, quieter now, more reflective. He gave me a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, and a letter filled with encouragement and love. It struck me then how much had shifted. Our relationship had transformed from dependence and resentment into respect and hope. Arriving in Seattle, the cool air and the scent of the ocean greeted me. Tom was there, smiling as if the years had only strengthened the connection we once shared. The days that followed were gentle and surprising walks along the Pacific coast, shared meals, and conversations that stretched into the evening. I realized I could laugh again, that I could enjoy life without obligation, and that my heart still had space for adventure and love. In those weeks, I observed the subtle ways in which taking responsibility for myself changed everything. I was no longer merely a caretaker or a mother defined by sacrifice. I was Hazel, a woman with a story, a life, and the capacity for joy. Watching the sun set over the ocean, listening to the waves, I understood that the years I had devoted to others had not been wasted. They had prepared me to appreciate freedom and self-respect when it finally arrived. I thought about Daniel, now striving to build his own life, and I felt a quiet pride. I understood that setting boundaries was not cruelty. It was a gift. It gave him the chance to grow, and me the chance to rediscover my own voice. And as I reflected on Kendra, I realized that some people will never change, and that their journey was not mine to carry. My task was to honor my own life and choices. In the calm of the Pacific evenings, I embraced a profound truth: it is never too late to choose yourself, to seek happiness and fulfillment on your own terms. I had spent decades giving, but now I understood that giving to yourself was equally vital. And in that realization, I felt an exhilaration. I had almost forgotten the freedom to live fully, honestly, and with intention. This chapter of my life had opened not with revenge, but with courage and clarity. I had set boundaries, witnessed growth in my son, and allowed myself to step into the joy and adventure I had long postponed. And if I could reclaim my life at 70, I knew that anyone, at any stage, could find the strength to do the same. As I stood on the porch of Tom's house, looking out over the Pacific Ocean, I realized how profoundly my life had changed. I was no longer the invisible mother, the one who sacrificed without acknowledgement. I had spoken my truth, set boundaries, and watched my son begin to take responsibility. I had reclaimed the part of myself that had been lost in decades of giving. Those weeks in Seattle were more than a vacation. They were a revelation. Walking barefoot in the sand, feeling the cold waves touch my feet, I remembered the dreams I had set aside for decades. Dreams of adventure, of love, of living fully and freely. Tom's presence reminded me that connection and affection can be rediscovered at any stage of life, and that the past does not define the possibilities of the future. I thought of Daniel and the letter he had given me before I left, the daisies he had carefully chosen, the words that told me to fly high. I understood that love, when paired with boundaries, nurtures growth rather than dependence. Watching him work to rebuild his life, seeing the effort and humility in his actions, I felt pride in a way I hadn't in years. It was a quiet, steady pride, built from knowing that my guidance and my insistence on responsibility had made a difference. Reflecting on Kendra, I realized that some people never change, and that was their journey to take, not mine to carry. I could let go of resentment, because holding on to it would only weigh down my heart. The lesson was clear. Unconditional love is powerful, but without boundaries, it can become a trap. Respect for oneself must come first, even when it feels impossible after decades of putting others before you. I thought of all the small sacrifices I had made, all the nights I had counted pennies, all the meals I had prepared silently, all the moments I had swallowed my pride for the sake of peace, and I realized those sacrifices were not wasted. They had shaped me, strengthened me, and prepared me for the courage I needed to take the next step in my life. Speaking up, drawing lines, and choosing joy did not diminish those years of giving, they elevated them. For the first time in decades, I felt the quiet joy of living for myself. I laughed easily, I spoke freely, and I allowed myself to enjoy moments without guilt. I could savor the Pacific breeze, the warmth of conversation, the simple pleasure of being present without obligation. Every sunset was a reminder that life still held wonder, and that happiness is not a gift given by others, it is a choice we must take for ourselves. I knew now that it is never too late to reclaim your life, to rediscover your voice, and to allow yourself to be happy. I had spent 70 years learning to care for others, and now I was learning to care for myself. And the freedom, the exhilaration of that choice, was worth every fear and every risk. I hope anyone listening can hear this. It is never too late to choose yourself, to speak your truth, to set boundaries, to follow dreams that have waited patiently for decades. If you have felt invisible, if you have given too much and received too little, remember that your life is yours to claim. You deserve joy, love, and the adventure of living fully, no matter your age. And as I watched the waves crash endlessly against the shore, I whispered to myself that life's chapters can always turn, and the story is never truly over until we decide it is. I had chosen mine, and it was filled with possibility, courage, and light. If my story resonates with you, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on your own life, to consider where you might reclaim your voice, your joy, and your freedom. Like, share, and comment with your thoughts or experiences. Because sometimes, sharing our stories is the first step in finding our own strength and inspiring others to do the same.